hasn't been blooded so much. It's because they marched and we elected councilmen, congressmen. It's because they marched that we have Arthur Davis and Keith Ellison. Because they marched that I got the kind of education I got, that I got a law degree, the seat in the Illinois Senate, and ultimately in the United States Senate is because they marched that I stand before you here today.
All right.
Unity breakfast this morning, my bet is even greater than that. Because not only is my career the result of the work of the men and women who we honor here today. My very existence might not have been possible had it not been for some of the folks here today. A lot of people have been asking, well, you know, your father was from Africa. Your mother, she's a white woman from Kansas. I'm not sure that you have the same experience. I'm not trying to explain. You don't understand. See, my grandfather was a cook to the British in Kenya. Grew up in a small village. And all his life, that's all he was a cook and a houseboy. And that's what they called him, even when he was 60 years old. They called him a houseboy. Wouldn't call him by his last name. Call him by his first name. Sound familiar? And he had to carry a passbook around. Because Africans in their own land, in their own country at that time, because it was a British colony, could not move about freely. They could only go where they were told to go. They could only work where they were told to work. And yet, something happened back here in Selma, Alabama. Something happened in Birmingham that sent out what Bobby Kennedy called ripples of hope all around the world. Something happened when a bunch of women decided, we're going to walk instead of ride the bus. After a long day of doing somebody else's laundry, looking after somebody else's children. When men who had PhDs were working as plumbing porters decided that's enough. And we were going to stand up despite the risks for our dignity and our respect. That sent a shout across oceans. So then my grandfather began to imagine something different for his son. And his son, who grew up herding goats in a small village in Africa, could suddenly set his sights a little higher. And suddenly believe that maybe a black man in this world had a chance. And what happened in Selma, Alabama, and Birmingham also stirred the conscience of the nation. And it worried folks in the White House who said, you know, we're battling communism. How are we going to win the hearts and minds all across the world if right here in our own country, John, we're not observing the ideals that are set forth in our Constitution? We might be accused of being hypocrites. So the Kennedys decided we're going to do an airlift. We're going to go out to Africa. And we're going to start bringing young Africans over to this country and give them scholarships to study so that they can learn what a wonderful country America is. And this young man named Barack Obama got one of those tickets and came over to this country. Great-great-great-grandfather had owned slaves, but she had a different idea. There's some good craziness going on because they loved each other, and they decided, we know that in the world as it has been, it might not be possible for us to get together and have a child. But something stirred across the country because of what happened in Selma, Alabama, because some folks were willing to march across the bridge. And so they got together, and Barack Obama Jr. was born. Generation. God told him, your job is done. You'll see it. You'll be at the mountaintop and you can see what I promised. What I promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And I promise to you, you can see that I will fulfill that promise. Well, you won't go there. We're going to leave it to the Joshua generation.
All right.
Make sure it happens. There are still some battles that need to be fought. Some rivers that need to be crossed.
That's right.
Like Moses, the task was passed on to those who might not have been as deserving, might not have been as courageous, find themselves in front of the risks that their parents and their grandparents and great-grandparents had taken. But that doesn't mean they still don't have a burden that they have to shoulder. That they don't have some responsibilities. The previous generation, the Moses generation, pointed the way. They took us 90% of the way there, but we still got that 10% in order to cross over to the other side. And so the question, I guess, that I have today is, what's called of us in this Joshua generation? What do we do in order to fulfill that legacy, to fulfill the obligations and the debt that we owe to those who allowed us to be here today? Now, I don't think we can ever fully repay that debt. I think that we're always going to be looking back, but there are at least a few suggestions that I would have in terms of how we might fulfill that enormous legacy. The first is to recognize our history. John Lewis talked about why we're here today, but I worry sometimes. We've got Black History Month. We come down in March every year, once a year. We occasionally celebrate the various events of the Civil Rights Movement. We celebrate Dr. King's birthday, but it strikes me that understanding our history and knowing what it means is an everyday activity. Moses spoke to the people of Israel, telling them that he wasn't going to be going with them. He laid out what they should be doing. And one of the first things he said was he said, know your past. Know where you come from. Know how you were let out of bondage. Know how Pharaoh refused to let you go. And that God came down and visited all manner of plague and pestilence until finally the people were freed. Moses told the Joshua generation, don't forget where you came from. And I worry sometimes that the Joshua generation, in its success, forgets where it came from. Thinks it doesn't have to make as many sacrifices. Thinks that the very height of ambition is to make as much money as you can. Drive the biggest car and have the biggest house. And wear a Rolex watch. Get your own private jet. Get some of that Oprah money. And I think that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with making money. But if you know your history, then you know that there's a certain poverty of ambition involved in simply striving just for money. Materialism alone will not fulfill the possibilities of your existence. You have to fill that with something else. You have to fill it with the golden rule. You've got to fill it with thinking about others. And if we know our history, then we will understand that that is the highest mark of service. Second thing that the Joshua generation needs to understand is that the principles of equality that were set forth and were battled for have to be fought each and every day. It is not a one-time thing. I was remarking at the Unity Breakfast on the fact that the single most significant concern that this Justice Department under this administration has had with respect to discrimination has to do with affirmative action. that they had basically spent all their time worrying about colleges and universities around the country that are giving a little break to young African Americans and Hispanics to make sure that they can go to college too. I had a school in Southern Illinois that had set up a program for PhDs in math and science for African Americans. And the reason they had set it up is because we only had less than 1% of PhDs in science and math go to African Americans. At a time when we are competing in a global economy, when we're not competing just against folks in North Carolina or Florida or California, we're competing against folks in China and India, and we need math and science majors. This university thought that this might be a nice thing to do. And the Justice Department wrote them a letter saying, we are going to threaten to sue you for reverse discrimination unless you cease this program. And it reminds us that we still got a lot of work to do. And that the basic enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, the injustice that still exists within our criminal justice system, the disparity in terms of how people are treated in this country continues. It has gotten better, and we should never deny that it's gotten better. But we shouldn't forget that better is not good enough. And until we've got absolute equality in this country in terms of people being or they're different, but that is something that we've got to continue to work on, and the Joshua generation has a significant task in making that happen. Third thing, we've got to recognize that we fought for civil rights, but we've still got a lot of economic rights that have to be dealt with. 46 million people uninsured in this country, despite spending more money on health care than any nation on earth. Makes no sense. As a consequence, we've got what's known as a health care disparity in this nation, because many of the uninsured are African American or Latino. Life expectancy is lower. Almost every disease is higher within minority communities. The health care gap. Blacks are less likely in their schools to have adequate funding. We have less qualified teachers in those schools. We have fewer textbooks in those schools. We got, in some schools, rats outnumbering computers. That's called the achievement gap. You got a health care gap, you got an achievement gap. You got Katrina, still undone. Went down to New Orleans 3 weeks ago. Still looks bombed out. Still not rebuilt. When 9/11 happened, the federal government has a special program of grants to help rebuild. They waived any requirements that Manhattan would have to pay 10% of the cost of rebuilding. When Hurricane Andrews happened in Florida, 10% requirement, they waived it because they understood that some disasters are so devastating that we can't expect a community to rebuild. New Orleans, the largest natural catastrophe in our history. The federal government says, where's your 10%? There's an empathy gap. There's a gap in terms of sympathizing for those folks in New Orleans as bad as sympathizing with folks elsewhere. It's not a gap that the American people felt because we saw how they responded. But somehow our government didn't respond with that same sense of compassion, that same sense of kindness. And here's the worst part. The tragedy in New Orleans happened well before the hurricane struck. Because in many of those communities, there were so many young men in prison, so many kids dropping out, so little hope, a hope gap. A hope gap that still pervades too many communities all across the country and right here in Alabama. So the question is then, what are we, the Joshua generation, doing to close those gaps? Are we doing every single thing that we can do in Congress in order to make sure that early education is adequately funded and making sure that we are raising the minimum wage so if somebody works each and every day that they can have some dignity and some respect? Are we ensuring that if somebody leaves the job and they're getting retrained, and that help them get back on their feet? Are we making sure that we're giving a second chance to those who have strayed and gone to prison but want to start a new life? Government alone can't solve all those problems. The government can help. And it's the responsibility of the Joshua generation to make sure that we have a government that is as responsive. But that brings me to one other point, though, Joshua generation, and that is this, that, you know, it's not enough just to ask what the government can do for us. It's important for us to ask what we can do for ourselves. So one of the signature aspects of the civil rights movement was the degree of discipline and fortitude that was instilled in all the people who participated. Imagine young people, 16, 17, 20, 21, back straight, eyes clear, suit and tie, sitting down at the lunch counter knowing somebody's going to spill milk on you, but you have the discipline to understand that you are not going to retaliate. Because in showing the world how disciplined we were as a people, we were able to win over the conscience of the nation. I can't say for certain that we have instilled that same sense of moral clarity and purpose in this generation. Bishop, sometimes I feel like we've lost it a little bit. You know, I'm fighting to make sure that our schools are adequately funded. All across the country we have inequities in how schools are funded because it's relying on property taxes. People who happen to be born in wealthy districts, somehow they get better schools than folks who are born in poor districts. And that's not how it's supposed to be. That's not the American way. But I tell you what, even as I fight on behalf of more education funding, more equity, I have to also say that if parents don't turn off the television set